Thank you so much for that really beautiful introduction. And I really have to say it's very moving to me to hear that so many of you read my work. I always think of it as like a gift that you spend time with me and my thinking when you're reading my pieces. And it's also very moving that you all thought of me to bring me here. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm so glad that I could make it in person and meet you all face to face too. Just want to say that this department at SFU is such an important department. You have such spectacular people here, and professors, students, and this is a department that I was very excited to visit because you're all doing such fantastic critical work. And I'm really excited to show you this new work, you all, and have conversations about it. So thank you. Okay, so my talk today is called Body Monitor Metaphor, the Trans Body as Media or Toward a Trans Critique of Mediation. See. Okay. Yeah. The Cascade computer virus, like the first recorded cases of the AIDS epidemic, emerged in the 1980s. The virus is programmed to lay dormant in infected programs until a certain time trigger is met. When the program runs, the computer interface falls apart, almost literally. Individual letters and symbols in the command line descend to the bottom of the screen like drops in a downpour. As the legibility of the interface falls apart, the letters and symbols make a ticking noise as each piece falls, as if simulating the sound of glyphs hitting the lower edge of the screen. As the virus runs, the screen accumulates piles of these cascading pieces, resulting in a heap of incomprehensible symbols at the bottom of the screen. It is as if the computer's interface in its failure has suddenly become heavy and susceptible to the effects of gravity. Kate McKinney and Dylan Mulvin write about the intertwined history of the AIDS epidemic and the emergence of the AIDS computer virus in the late 1980s to early 1990s in Bugs, Rethinking the History of Computing. They write, when we reach for analogies to explain the risk involved in trusting our network connections, we often light upon the language of sex, the technical and biological dangers of infections, and our fears of vulnerability, end quote. Biological metaphor and institutional construction, often essentialized to the body, has functioned as an organizing system in the way we make sense of virality, both in the sense of computational flows, networks, and control, and also in the sense in the way the body itself is sequenced. Its process is narrativized to us through metaphors of domination, uncontrolled replication, and coloniality. For instance, the idea of virality itself as an uncontrolled replication of RNA within our bodies by a so-called foreign entity. The medical industrial complex has a hold on both the metaphors that construct the way we conceive of our bodies in piecemeal parts, divided further and further down from the chest to the lungs, to their lobes, cells, and the way we metaphorize our bodies in relationship to computer systems, imagined and constructed with similar system or underlying logics. Cascade's effects are documented and archived by Danoct1, who, in a video titled virus.dos.cascade, describes the mechanics of the virus itself and its effects on the computer and the labor of the user. Quotes, and then after the Cascade virus does it for the first time, it'll keep doing it every 30 seconds, he says. Computing is impossible while it's dropping the letters on the screen, end quote. The Cascade virus disrupts the visual grammar of the computer interface in order to signal error and failure to the user, with the screen itself taking on a completely unexpected relationship to gravity and motion. Cascade turns the computer interface into a jumbled mess of signals that cease to signify in the horizontal order of the command line, and instead enacts a disruptive new visual system of text, calling attention to the symbols on screen as parts and piecemeal bits, their sudden verticality and trickle downward, exposing the computer screen itself as an arbitrary metaphor for order, legibility, logic, labor, and regulation. I write this now during the time of the COVID pandemic, with these metaphors of the failure of the glitch and virus endlessly circulating in our popular consciousness. Legacy Russell devotes a chapter to the virus in Glitch Feminism, a manifesto titled Glitch is Virus. What can we learn from a computer virus, she writes. A machine transforms into one that cannot perform, that quite literally cannot work, forgets how to work, works against its function. It changes the endemic correlation between value and order, dangerous in its uselessness. End quote. The virus transforms closed, expected, and legible computational systems so that they suddenly blossom and open up to failure and unexpected protocols, grammars, and visualities. The presence of the glitch itself critiques the normative system of domination in which it exists, calling attention to a structural normativity that is so pervasive it presents itself as transparent or unmediating. Rosa Meckman writes in her Glitch Studies Manifesto that, quote, the quest for complete transparency, the perfect invisible interface, has changed the computer system into a highly complex assemblage that is hard to penetrate, and sometimes even completely closed off. The system consists of layers of obfuscated protocols that find their origin in ideologies, economies, political hierarchies, and social conventions, end quote. The work of computer viruses, glitch art, and theory is one of breaking down metaphors of overarching totality, used both by computers and by the institutional systems they mimic, and their use in practices of domination. Glitch theory questions the systems of order that these metaphors enact in the way that they are narrativized and deployed on bodies, on labor, on machines. These metaphors of the body, of biology, of medicine, naturalize a certain existence and orientation toward institutions, toward the progression of time, toward the consolidation of bodies into files and formats that reproduce themselves within these neoliberal systems of control, anchored always in constructions of gender, race, and sexuality as administrative and disciplinary systems of order and categorization. The screen has always functioned as an intermediary, giving us the illusion of control and immediacy through its operating logics. Quote, this is where the problem lies, in the invisibility that becomes seemingly organic, Russell writes. Quote, this normative ordinary is of violence, suggesting a natural order in lieu of the most unnatural system of control, end quote. There is no computational machine and no interface that exists in a vacuum. The computer's visual interface must be thought of as a text or a type of media, one that is historically and materially specific, one that is read just as, in Russell's words, the body is a text. Every time we define ourselves, we choose definitions, names that reduce the ways our bodies can be read, end quote. The interface's destruction by the cascade virus reveals the deceptive seamlessness of the normative power systems that become enmeshed within the visual grammars of computer systems, a system of control that mimics larger institutional systems of control, and teaches us what it means to be an abiding citizen within them. I want to show you an image. It is an X-ray taken on February 10th, 2021 at 9:04 p.m. It is an image of the chest. The lungs are at the center, structured by the bright white scaffolding of the ribs and spine. The image is flattened, collapsing depth into itself, giving the appearance of ribs curling around the two spaces where the lungs are meant to be, surrounded by the brighter fluorescent white of the surrounding structures, clavicles, scapulas, the bones of the arms. The two hollows at the center of the image are visibly uneven in shape and size. The left side of the image reveals a dark hollow about the size of a fist, the space lined with what looks like white and vascular tendrils that extend and net across the space where the lungs should be. The right side of the image, which contains a larger, darker hollow, is similarly lined with this opaque veil. The hospital notes for this image, reviewed by a doctor named Madge L. Wickstrom, MD, reads this image of my body for me. Findings/impression. Consolidation in the middle and right lower lobes and slight increased opacity in the lower left lobe, consistent with the clinical history of atypical pneumonia. No effusion in pneumothorax, end quote. The language of opacity is present here in the reading of my body. Consolidation is a word I'm learning years later, used in radiology to describe what is imaged when the air that was within the lungs and alveoli become replaced with something denser, visualized as an opacity that does not let the X-rays through entirely, oftentimes liquid or mass or something like pus or blood or water. Consolidation is defined in the glossary of terms for thoracic radiology, recommendations of the Nomenclature Committee of the Fleischner Society, published in 1984 as, quote, the process by which air in the lung is replaced by products of disease, rendering the lung solid, as in pneumonia, end quote. The X-ray images opacity. It renders opacity, ironically, tangible and visible. These radiology images invert the world, turn it inside out. We often imagine the function of the lungs as crucially needing to hold something, and that crucial something is air. A healthy lung itself is supposed to be transparent, invisible, only able to be imaged as an absence, a dark spot, something missing. The language of opacity is ever present in terms used to describe the imaging of the lungs. While consolidation is a word used to describe a kind of visual opacity that blots out the distinct systems and structures of the lungs from view, it is distinct from ground glass opacities, another term used to describe the visualization of opacity in X-ray and computed tomography, or CT imaging. Ground glass opacities are defined in the glossary as, quote, any extended, finely granular pattern or pulmonary opacity within which normal anatomic details are partly obscured, from a fancied resemblance to etched or braided glass, end quote. In the case of ground glass opacities, they describe a kind of partly obscured image that, quote, doesn't obscure the lung vasculature, as opposed to consolidation, which does, end quote. There's something startling here in the visual parallel of diseased lungs imperfectly and only partially letting in the light of the X-ray, producing a hazy veil of light in the same way that a scratched and a braided pane of glass might obscure our view into the interior of a church, a shower. My lungs in these images were literally opaque, my body holding an opacity. My hospital after visit summary reads, reason for admission to hospital, acute hypoxic respiratory failure due to COVID PNA or pneumonia. This image was taken of my lungs in the emergency room of the hospital after I was admitted, unable to breathe, my lungs filled with fluid. In this moment, my body became celluloid, microfilm, tracing paper, the abraded transparent glass of a window, the media through which X-rays were shown. Architecture historian Beatrice Colomina writes in her essay, X-ray, that when Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen first published his very recent discovery of the X-ray in December of 1895 in an article entitled On a New Kind of Rays, a Preliminary Communication, he wrote about a new form of transparency in which bodies behave to X-rays as turbid media to light. A floating technical surface acts as the most intimate witness of an otherwise hidden interior. An architecture is established that inverts the classical relationship between inside and outside. My body, a form of media, alternatingly transparent and opaque, through which constructions of inside and outside are contested, a catalytic site of reversal, a calling of attention to the tenuous structures and membranes that demarcate the invisible interior of the body from what is visible, what is outside. This is a line that is continuously drawn across my body as a site of litigation of the biological, the citizen, the institutional. This experience is not unfamiliar for me as a trans person, reaching towards something, and a fundamentally felt misalignment between the way my body feels and yet is perceived by, touched by, and interfaced with the world. My body has always been a medium through which I witness its own mediation, displaced, diffracted, continuously blinking in its signals and the interpretation of its significations. My body is a still frame of Stan Brackage's moth light, bright light shining through the dense veins and capillaries of found foliage layered on celluloid. A piece of X-ray footage spliced, reorganized, decontextualized, and placed in Barbara Hammer's Sanctus. My body is the lens, alternatingly transparent and opaque, refocusing light. These ideologies that constitute the body too constitute the computer. In On Software or the Persistence of Visual Knowledge, Wendy Chun untangles software's ideological and metaphorical systems as mediated by constructions of transparency and obfuscation. Chun writes, quote, for what is software if not the very effort of making something explicit, of making something intangible visible, while at the same time rendering the visible, such as the machine, invisible, end quote. This accounting of the often inverted and interlocking relationships between visuality and opacity is fundamentally a questioning of how the fictions of how the computer and the body are governed by these metaphors of transparency and their relationship to ideological systems of control. Chun writes, it is truly remarkable that software, designed to obfuscate the machine and create a virtual one based on buried commands, has led to the overwhelming notion of computation as transparent. The notion of transparency has less to do with the actual technical operations than with the micro world established by computation. Importantly, the choices operating systems offer limit the visible and the invisible, the imaginable and the unimaginable. Software replicates institutional ideology in miniature. It constructs us, mediates us. Calling attention to these mediating ideologies as contiguous across the visibility and obfuscation of software and across the visibility and opacity of the body through medical imaging shows us how these systems stem from the same ideological systems or sites of control. To draw these lines of continuity across different systems of institutionalized visualization shows us how institutional ideology is mediated across the body and across the software user. It is a call to attention to these practices of representation, of mediation that normalize what is imaginable for us. 4 years after this X-ray of my lungs was taken, I write this now in the midst of NYU Langone health system withholding healthcare for trans youth at the start of the new administration, and an overt and violent removal of the word transgender from official pages hosted by the United States government, including historical sites like the Stonewall Monument. I write this as I watch executive order after executive order being issued, a barrage of pain and erasure of trans life from history. And in the middle of everything, I have been rereading Susan Stryker's My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, Reforming Transgender Rage, originally published in 1994. In it, she writes, within this dynamic field, the subject must constantly police the boundary constructed by its own founding in order to maintain the fictions of inside and outside against a regime of signification/materialization, whose intrinsic instability produces the rupture of subjective boundaries as one of its regular features. Transgender rage is a queer fury, an emotional response to conditions in which it becomes imperative to take up, for the sake of one's own continued survival as a subject, a set of practices that precipitates one's exclusion from a naturalized order of existence and seeks to maintain itself as the only possible basis for being a subject. There's something reassuring for me to read this 31 years later in the midst of everything, the trans body as the site of contestation, the boundary across which these fictions of inside and outside are drawn, my body the site of the institutional metaphor of what is the biological, of what defines the body and its possibilities, temporalities, and futurities. To read that my own experience of this world is something that connects me to her, decades later, puts words to the pit of my stomach feeling I've had about my own alignment with the world, the shifting membrane of where I begin and where the outside ends. This alignment is often narrativized as continuous and never changing over the course of a life. The birth certificates and documents we are born, documented by, continuous in their relationship to us and our bodies until we die and are documented again, then too. These worlds have never been stable, only constant in how what Stryker writes feels like the way I am oriented in the world. Only constant in that it connects me to her and the trans people of color who came before me. These medical metaphors purport to represent, to visualize our bodies, but in so doing only visualize an opacity that crucially can be held. These metaphors are historically and temporally situated. They present a seemingly naturalized order to the way the body is arbitrarily constructed and litigated. They press against me in the way that I am documented in these files, these images, these documents. The way my body is narratively constructed when I read about how my own need for trans-affirming care is noted in my own hospital notes as justification articulated not to me, but to medical insurance companies. I am hyper-aware that my body itself is a kind of media, constantly mediated. I have been thinking lately of Susan Murray's evocation of Neil Postman in a talk she gave at the Open Circuits Revisited conference in October 2024 about the history of media and television studies as it emerged from our department at NYU, the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication. Here she situates one of the roots of media studies as studies of mediation and its effects brought from the field of media ecology. From Postman's The Medium is the Metaphor, in which he critiques and adds to Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message. A message denotes a specific, concrete statement about the world, but the forms of our media, including the symbols through which they permit conversation, do not make such statements. They are rather like metaphors, working by unobtrusive but powerful implication to enforce their special definitions of reality. Whether we are experiencing the world through the lens of speech or the printed word of the television camera, our media metaphors classify the world for us, sequence it, frame it, enlarge it, reduce it, color it, argue a case for what the world is like. Transgender studies and transgender people have always contested the way that these metaphors construct the world, the way that the body exists as a type of media, constantly mediated, a film or cell through which flows of domination and normalization are projected. And transgender studies has always been enacting its own form of media studies. Trans people, and especially trans people of color, have always been aware of the mediation of the body, of the media of the body, and how the metaphors that construct it, deployed by systemic and institutional systems of power, similarly sequence us, frame us, enlarge us, reduce us, color us, and argue a case for what the world is like. A world that we know deeply and fundamentally has never truly been how the world is constructed. Jules Gill Peterson writes in her book, Histories of the Transgender Child, that, quote, metaphor tells us more about the language and practice of science than about the objects, animals, and silenced bodies subjugated through scientific practice, unquote. Transgender studies and trans thinkers have always critiqued the mediation of the body by the state and the medical industrial complex, and the way the body is insufficiently able to be articulated or held by systems of documentation that make us simultaneously hypervisible, and in our hypervisibility, able to be violently erased. The capillaries that connect the cells, the lobes of the lungs, to the body, to the legislation of the state, to the selected preservation of history through the archive have been documented in early clinical studies of transsexuality and the medical archive with trans people as documented rather than documenting under the surveillant eye of the medical practitioner, and the systems and structures of diagnostic observation and documentative ethnography. Stryker writes that since at least the 19th century in Europe and the United States, transgender phenomena have taunted the social order in ways that have spurred the development of sexology, psychiatry, endocrinology, and other medical scientific fields involved in social regulatory practice. The clinical bibliography, specifically related to transgender phenomena, runs to many thousands of publications and continues to grow even now. Transgender studies is now in a position to treat this immense body of clinical work as its archive. Transgender studies and trans of color critique have treated the medical archive with a great deal of skepticism, with the acknowledgement of the embeddedness of this archive, with systems and structures of anti-Black racialization as co-constitutive with the regulation of gender and trans life. Gil Peterson engages with these impossibilities and the limitations of the medical archive with regard to Black, trans, and trans of color life in Trans of Color Critique Before Transsexuality. How has the overexposure of medicine as an available archive of transgender history produced an incalculable deflation of trans of color life's intelligibility, especially Black trans life? What effects have practices of self-protection, strategic invisibility, and escape had on the hospital's archive? In other words, how does the use of the medical archive distort the very historicity of Black trans and trans of color life through the recording of differing types of absence, silence, and opacity? It is in these relationships that between so-called transparency and its material linkages to absences, silences, and opacities that we can see the way in which the body has been mediated and serves as the media through which history is projected, with the trans body as the key frame through which these processes are shown. The deliberate construction of the body within systems of domination, the narratives of embodiment as being somehow unchanging, and our relationship to embodied gender and sex in documents and documentation, and thus the state as being some kind of stable relationship hovering above us, with us throughout the length of a life and after. And trans life still fundamentally questions this mediation and the relationship between embodiment, transparency, opacity, time, archives, and history. I think of the concept of transparency that is imposed by discourses and litigations on trans life, a continuing excavation of a violent clarity of the trans body itself, as if itself is a sheet of glass, as if itself is an X-ray shining through something thin, the air enclosed within the lungs, and not bouncing off the opaque density of bone. In thinking through the transparency and opacity of course, I am brought to Edouard Glissant. He writes in Poetics of Relation, but difference itself can still contrive to reduce things to the transparent. If we examine the process of understanding people and ideas from the perspective of Western thought, we discover that its basis is the requirement for transparency. In order to understand and thus accept you, I have to measure your solidity with the ideal scale, providing me with the grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgments. I have to reduce. Agree to not merely for the right of difference, but carrying this further, agree to the right to opacity that is not enclosure within an impenetrable autarky, but subsistence within an irreducible singularity. Glissant critiques the ideology of transparency itself as a political device, the body made known and knowable, able to be quantified and scaled to a finite system of measurement that allows for comparison, which makes hierarchy and systems of surveillance and racialization possible. The idea of transparency itself, that we become so documented and legible to the state, ourselves and bodies held up to this material scale of difference and worth as if it pre-existed the body itself, presents a logic of a mediation, that the body's ability to be quantified is something innate, when in fact, the idea of transparency, legibility, and order itself are types of mediation, in the same way that software, an incredibly opaque structural medium, presents itself within the fiction of transparency. The trans body becomes so tied to transparency, and thus to the necropolitical concept of documentation, to the extent that this representational metaphor of documentation becomes our bodies within the state of institutional control. And so we too can become eliminated by the elimination of these documents. This is what I have been seeing in the current administration, the idea of trans life as being so litigated, so documented, so transparent and tied to the existence of these scales, institutions, and documents, that the elimination of this documentation is also an attempt to structure the elimination of our existences and futurities. The illusion that trans life becomes its own mediation, that our irreducible bodies in existence have become so tied to these systems of so-called transparency removes the awareness that we are opaque, irreducible to begin with. Our bodies, opaque media, dense enough to deflect the passage of light, X-rays, alternatingly transparent and opaque. I write this as I sort through my own relationship to the medical archive, to virality, to trends of color embodiment and opacity, what it means to be debilitatingly sick, and what our relationship to time is after significant viral infection. Quote, machines are expected to work well and work quickly. A computer virus triggers the machinic responses of slowness in ways that are unpredictable to the user, endless buffering, crashing, damaging, deleting, reformatting. This slowness shifts time and space, altering a person's relationship to the machine, Russell writes. In the same way that the Cascade virus continuously reboots in 30-second increments and continuously renders the screen illegible and computation impossible, my own body shifted unpredictably during and after COVID. I was hospitalized for several days in 2021 before vaccines were widely available with COVID pneumonia and what my hospital paperwork calls acute hypoxic respiratory failure. I remember in bits and pieces the oxygen machine that roared loudly in my bedroom for over a month, attached to me by clear long hoses that pushed oxygen into my lungs, how I couldn't stand for long enough to brush my teeth, instead spitting into a bowl my partner held under my chin while I sat in bed. The scissors she used to cut up my food so that I could gasp for breath between small closed mouth bites. For weeks after my hospitalization, I strengthened my lungs by inhaling deeply through a device called an incentive spirometer. Each burning full breath measured 700 milliliters in the spirometer's plastic casing. I learned much later that my healthy lung capacity is over 3.5 times this amount. I lived with a need for oxygen that exceeded the physical capacity of my body. I was reminded of this lack, the inability of this need to be met every time I breathed in deeply, painfully pulling my chest open to let air into my lungs, opening my chest to form a vacuum of air, desperate to pull oxygen in. Instead, all I felt was a gasping stillness and pain as my lungs struggled to expand. The strange feeling of my chest is hardened, solid. With each gasping breath, my lungs were unable to hold the amount of air that would keep me from passing out without the aid of a machine. It felt as though I'd finished a marathon and then was holding my breath whenever I moved, my body being met with a dizzying experience of feeling as though I had taken no breath at all. This misalignment I experienced between the way my body felt, what it reached toward, and the changing way the world interfaced with me was constant, complicated, resonant, and diffractive of my own experiences of trans life and disability. My lungs, previously a seamless system, had suddenly become a subject to this endless buffering, crashing, damaging, deleting, reformatting. At the time, I couldn't walk the 10 steps to the bathroom without feeling completely suffocated, out of breath, the membrane between my body and the outside world violently jarred. Years later, I still experience echoes of these embodied crashes, glitches, and reboots. This enduring viral presence, it reinforces my awareness of my body's heightened mediation in the world through race, trans identity, and disability, and queerness. I've always been aware of how my body is not hailed or anticipated by normative time in the spaces I am expected to inhabit. My painfully glitched movements reminds me constantly of the way that my body and existence do not fit, are an anomaly in larger systems and structures of labor and power. We use the body to give material form to an idea that has no form, an assemblage that is abstract, Russell writes. One of the arguments she makes in glitch feminism is that the glitch can be used to trouble the idea of a body, which itself is a metaphor that presents a fictional order and obfuscates its own origins, just like the supposed seamlessness of the screen. The body as a concept is ideological and deeply connected to race, blackness, empire, and domination. Russell argues, produced under historical exploitative conditions of labor, under expectations of institutional control and domination, under the shifting boundaries of what is recognized and legible by governments and institutions. In the same way, the computer is a metaphor, an assemblage that gives material form to ideology, so is the body. Thank you.